made a video called Reconsidering Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, I used to watch Brian when I was a Catholic. I converted from atheism to Catholicism, and Brian was actually a big factor in me getting into traditional Catholicism, going to the Latin Mass at a FSSP parish. I flirted a bit with SSPX, Eastern Catholicism, Sedevacantism. That got me to look into the first 1,000 years of church history because I was seeing chaos, so much confusion in the past 60, 70 years of the history of the Catholic Church with Vatican II and the Novus Ordo and the modern saints. So I looked at the first 1,000 years and I saw that it wasn't a papal monarchy, that it was a consensus-based ecclesiology, and it was Orthodox, and that Catholicism had added a lot onto the faith, and that they've admitted this, especially in recent documents like the Alexandria document, Chady document, the Ratzinger formula, is that they admit that their system was an innovation. And not just that, Catholic Church, the liturgical life was not good at 99% of the parishes, Novus Ordo, versus in Orthodoxy, they all have a reverent divine liturgy. The modern saints, St. Paisios, St. Nectarios, they are just as Orthodox as the church fathers, as the apostles. They're still making amazing saints. And I saw that the spirit that was guiding the modern Catholic saints was different, the way that they praise false religions. And it was kind of following the spirit of Vatican II. And now that I've been Orthodox for a while, I realize that it's so much deeper, and it's been interesting to see, Brian continue to be ortho-curious, and he made this recent video, and I just wanted to answer some of his questions, because I had similar questions coming from a Catholic, a trad Catholic background. He ends the video by saying the most pressing issue to him is, what Orthodox church does he go to? There's Greek, there's Russian, there's Romanian, there's OCA, which one am I going to go to? Well, the good thing is that like the church has always been, it's a communion of autocephalous churches. So that is the Orthodox Church. And there's actually a really good locator online called Orthodoxy in America. I think he said he lived in Edmonton, Canada, where you can look up that on the locator and find a canonical Orthodox church and go visit it. Go visit all of them in your area. Ultimately, the rational arguments are great, but Orthodoxy is about experience. And that's why I try to get people to come and visit an Orthodox church. Come and see. That is Orthodoxy. And he had a question about how does these patriarchs from the old world have a jurisdiction in North America? And since there's different jurisdictions, there's no legitimate Orthodox church in North America. But this issue isn't new. We can go to church history because it started in Jerusalem, and the apostles went out and they were preaching the gospel. They were ordaining more bishops, priests, deacons across the world. And we see in church history that there's jurisdictional disputes. And over time, especially when you start with a missionary setting, it takes hundreds of years because Orthodoxy is spread through time and culturation. I mean, Orthodoxy is an entire way of life, so it takes time. Many of these jurisdictions and churches were started to serve certain immigrant communities. Some of them were started for explicitly missionary setting, like the OCA, the Orthodox Church in America, which, if you look at the history in Alaska and Canada, is that the Russians came to bring the gospel to the Alaskan people and to the Californians, and we have American and Alaskan Orthodox saints. It doesn't require a universal jurisdiction to do this. We can see in the 1st century, the 2nd century, the 3rd century, this existed. And we're seeing now that in North America, these countries with lots of immigrants, there's these jurisdictional issues. And of course, they're going to get fixed with time, but it doesn't mean you should not become Orthodox or you need a universal jurisdiction. It just means that as more and more people become Orthodox, then it makes sense to have just one bishop for a state, one bishop for a city. But it requires the Orthodox population to grow, enculturation, Americans, Canadians becoming Orthodox, all of which is happening. I've actually heard, I think it's in either Idaho or Montana, that one of these states has already, all the churches there have talked about just having a bishop for their state. So again, this is going to happen with time, and this shouldn't keep you from becoming Orthodox. Early on in his video, he compares him staying in the Catholic Church to staying in a marriage. You can't just abandon your marriage, and that I totally agree with. But it doesn't mean that if you're trying to be married to Christ and to his church, but you're married to something that isn't actually the church or that has deformed, like a Protestant could say the same thing, the Lutheran church isn't perfect, but I'm going to fix it. It's the best option. So ultimately you should be looking for the true church. And I don't think it's shallow to, if you realize you're in a false church, a wrong church that has innovations, to leave and to join the body of Christ, because ultimately that's where our loyalty is. And he said it's kind of a bad reason to become Orthodox. Like, oh, I'm becoming Orthodox because I'm not happy in Catholicism. I think that that's not a good reason to stay Orthodox, but ultimately all of these reasons, all of these apologetics, the only reason for them is to come and visit a local Orthodox church and read the Orthodox saints, participate in the liturgy. Once you experience that, you will know Orthodoxy is true in your heart, is that that's how God reaches us. So you can come into Orthodoxy for the worst reasons, but God will transform your heart. And ultimately, it's about just stepping into the Orthodox Church. And that's why I'm glad I did as a former Catholic, because I realized Christianity is so much deeper. And I don't think that the challenges in the Catholic Church are reasonable. He says they're reasonable challenges and it just needs reform. But no, the problem is the papal system and all the innovations that they have added. Throughout the video, he talks about this idea of the chaos of egalitarianism. And I agree with that ultimately you can't have just everyone trying to be equal. You need hierarchy. There's more nuance to it, where it's not just, you want egalitarianism or you want absolute hierarchy. You want one man, the Pope, who has papal infallibility and he can have these ex cathedra statements. Is like, it doesn't need to be that way. What we see in the Bible, in church history, is that the church is conciliar, that they get together, the bishops get together, and they rule on these issues. Bishops can be wrong. He brings up, Peter as a chief of the apostles, and that's what we agree with. But the problem is the word concept fallacy is Peter being chief does not mean he is a dictator and supremacist over the other bishops. Is the chief is a servant. He's a servant leader and he can be wrong.
Is the question of how equals judge one another. If they're truly equal, then they can't judge each other, because none has a greater authority to impose the judgment and will on anyone else.
Well, equals can judge each other. And yes, that is true. That's why Paul rebuked Peter. It required an equality between the apostles. If Peter was above reproach, was above rebuke, was really something more than a bishop, he was the Pope, then that wouldn't happen. And so I'm surprised he didn't bring that up, because clearly what we see in Scripture and what we see throughout church history is that the Pope is worthy of criticism. The Pope can be judged. In the Catholic system, what it says in Catholic canon law is that no one can judge the Pope, but we can judge the Pope. And that doesn't mean that we don't want hierarchy. It's ultimately the highest hierarch is Christ. There are these operational roles, like all bishops are equal, but we have metropolitans over certain cities, we have patriarchs over a certain autocephalous church, but ultimately all bishops are sacramentally equal. But the problem with the papacy is that the papacy actually is it's more than a bishop. It's more than a bishop because of the charism of infallibility. And we can see, if we look in the first 1,000 years, there are so many schisms. Schisms where Rome is in schism with the church. There's moments where councils condemn the popes, like Pope Honorius, Pope Vigilius, showing that the bishops together in a conciliar model are above the Bishop of Rome, and the Bishop of Rome is not infallible, that he can be wrong. Having a view of hierarchy where ultimately there needs to be someone that you cannot judge a human person, that is wrong. Like in a marriage, yes, the husband is the head and the wife is the body, but that doesn't mean that the wife can't use judgment against her husband. Every hierarchical structure only works because there is a relationship which requires judgment and discernment. And anyone really questioning this, I recommend that you go to the Vatican website and you look at the Alexandrian Chedi document. These documents are Vatican approved, and they admit all the Orthodox points that the papacy in its Vatican I form is a innovation after the schism with the Gregorian reforms, and there's all these forgeries like the donation of Constantine, the Simantian forgeries, the pseudo-Isidorian decretals, that the papacy becomes something that it wasn't in the first 1,000 years. I mean, in the Catholic system, the Pope picks every single bishop in the world. We can just go to the First Council of Nicaea, read Canon 4 and 6. They're very clear that the Pope has a customary honor. And it's not just because of St. Peter. It's because St. Peter and St. Paul both died in Rome. The Bishop of Antioch is also a successor of Peter. So it doesn't mean that the Bishop of Rome is infallible or has a universal jurisdiction. These Vatican-approved documents refute that. And also the Ratzinger formula that says that Rome must not require from the East except papal supremacy. Again, that's the difference between primacy and supremacy. There is a first among equals, but they are equals. Just like, in the Supreme Court. That's how it works in America, is we have Supreme Court justices who are all equal, but there is a first among equal, a chief, a leader. But it doesn't mean that you can't judge them. We can just look at Vatican II. It says Orthodox are the other lung in the church. Catholic Church canonizes Orthodox saints. They say we have valid sacraments. I mean, nothing is missing in the Orthodox Church. But I think even Brian would agree that going to your average Catholic church, your Novus Ordo church, you're not going to really have that good of an experience versus something more traditional Catholicism versus an Orthodoxy. Every divine liturgy is reverent. You can read our saints. There's no, post-Vatican II mindset. And he brings up some evidences that he thinks are strong for papal supremacy. St. Maximus, he talks about how Rome is above all the churches in the world. But this context is very important because when we're just reading quotes, kind of quote mining, we're losing the context of it. So St. Maximus is in a dispute where these other churches are against him. So he's siding with Rome, and Rome was long a center for orthodoxy, little o orthodoxy, preserving the true faith. And so St. Maximus is siding with Rome and giving them a lot of honor because they are right in this theological dispute. And we can see other places in St. Maximus's writing where he doesn't think the Pope is absolutely required and the Pope can be a heretic, which shows that he didn't have the Vatican I view. And so, these different quotes, we can find these honorific high language that, this is the mother of all churches. This church has jurisdiction over the entire world. We can see that for the Bishop of Jerusalem, the Bishop of Antioch. All these different sees, we can see this high language. And so once you understand that, hey, when I'm reading these quotes, they used high language in these times. They used it to describe the emperor, to describe a certain bishop. They use this high language it doesn't equate Vatican I, especially when popes are excommunicated by the church. He also brings up the Tome of Leo and the Council of Chalcedon, where it says Peter is spoken through Leo. Well, again, this same honorific language is used lots of time throughout church history. We can see that the Tome of Leo wasn't just automatically accepted as, it came from the Pope, so we're going to accept it. They examined it, they compared it with other things like St. Cyril's writings to see if it was orthodox or not. So this can't be used as a proof of papal supremacy. It's just, again, high language because it's like the Pope is right.
Why did the bishops in Chalcedon feel they needed to judge Theodoret if Leo had already reinstated him?
Well, they didn't recognize Roman jurisdiction in the eastern provinces. So Leo's reinstating for them was not decisive. A decision has to be made in the east.
If the Bishop of Jerusalem says something right, you could say, James is spoken through you. I mean, it doesn't mean that the Vatican I view of the papacy, that the Pope's universal magisterium is infallible and he has ex cathedra statements and all this. Like, all this is baggage and presuppositions that are brought into the text when they're reading it. And so once you try and view it from the Orthodox view, which the Vatican has admitted, you see that it makes a lot more sense. It makes a lot more sense that the Catholic system has evolved, especially after the schism. I mean, just think about how impractical it would be if the Bishop of Rome had to pick every bishop in the entire world. We see, again, in the early canons like Nicaea, that it was local bishops selecting other bishops, and the Pope just had a customary honor. That's what the church was. It was a communion of autocephalous churches. The Church of Jerusalem, the Church of Constantinople, the Church of Antioch, the Church of Rome. They agreed on liturgy, the saints, the theology, the councils. They agreed on all this. That's what the church was. And so when he says that these autocephalous churches have no authority to excommunicate each other and you need universal jurisdiction to do that, no, it isn't true. There were times where Rome was out of communion with the other churches. We can see in the first 1,000 years there are autocephalous churches. The councils, the ecumenical councils, talk about autocephalous churches, creating new autocephalous churches. So the fact that Rome doesn't have autocephalous churches shows that they don't have the ecclesiology of the first 1,000 years. And there's all these prayers for peace within the churches. It shows that it wasn't just this papal system where you just submit to the Pope. It was, again, a federation, a communion of churches. And if a church is wrong, you're going to say, I'm not in communion with them, because you aren't. And there's levels of being in communion, with excommunication, stricting from the diptys, all of these different things. Like, history is very nuanced. The next thing he brings up is, Orthodox haven't had any councils, even though all you have to do is search it, and you can see that Orthodox have had binding pan-Orthodox councils, like the Hesychast synods, the Palamite synods, all of these councils that are universally accepted in the Orthodox Church, and we do have a universal dogma. And people like Ubi Petrus, Craig Trula from Orthodox Christian Theology have videos on all these papal proofs, on ecumenical councils. It's like the resources are there if this is really a holdup.
Orthodox do have binding pan-Orthodox synods. They could call one tomorrow. They called one in 2005. They called one in 1998. Pan-Orthodox, everyone accepting. And so it's like, that might be more than what the Roman Catholics have actually done in that time. So it's like, why do we even have to have this discussion? It's just based on abject ignorance. And I think some people's like, well, those are pan-Orthodox and not ecumenical councils. And this is a word concept fallacy, right? Roman Catholics accept binding non-ecumenical councils, such as Jerusalem in 1950, right? In the year 50, rather. So, like, they know you can have binding councils without the term ecumenical. Ecumenical is a specific definition in Nicaea too, where it has a reception of all the patriarchs and their synods in the pentarchy, right? So when you don't have a full pentarchy anymore, both Rome and the Eastern Orthodox can't have a definitional ecumenical council, but they can still have binding councils like Jerusalem's, and the Orthodox have had binding councils. For those who say, well, the Orthodox don't have these list of pan-Orthodox synods, it's some sort of pop apologetic. And first I'll say this. If it's a pop apologetic, it's a very new one, because really the first two people to really do this is Ben Bollinger, who sadly apostatized, and myself, right? We're the first people to say, no, we got to look at publicly and give a rationale. So we got to look at these pan-Orthodox synods, in apologetics. But for the actual conciliar and dogmatic authorities, they've known about these for a long time. Like Creed 2016 is the most recent example of normie bishops acknowledging that we have binding pan-Orthodox synods. And amongst that list is Constable 4, the great councils of Gregory Palamas, Constable 1484, the anti-Protestant councils, and like St. Peter Mogila and Jerusalem. And they mentioned another one in 1872. Now, just to say real briefly, Creed's list is matched by lists given by dogmatists in the 20th century, like St. Justin Popovich. It's accepted by all the jurisdictions, like Antioch and Moscow and Bulgaria, accept the same list of binding councils. So you don't need them to have, they didn't show up the Creed 2016, so we don't know if they accept these councils or not, because we have recent synodical documents where they do accept these councils. So these councils are binding for the Eastern Orthodox. Like Nicaea II, Rome only halfway received it and then didn't fully receive it until 100 years later. So like delayed reception of a binding synod, even ecumenical synod, is something that's occurred before. And we even said, if you're going to go with the Franks outside of Rome, we're going to the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, until they accepted Nicaea II. So this is something that that historians are privy to, and it should not surprise people.
A question he brings up is, what do you do if hierarchs disagree? If there's patriarchs that disagree? Well, again, we look at the saints in church history. We see that there has been lots of disputes. Like when St. Maximus was using that high language for the Pope, it's because the Patriarch of Constantinople was wrong, because he's not infallible. And ultimately, the ecclesiology in Orthodoxy is consensus-based and received over time. We know what Orthodoxy is. We can see what the saints teach. But the bigger problem is in Catholicism, what do you do if your Pope is teaching heresy? You said that only, equals can judge each other. Well, you can't judge the Pope. Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, Pope John Paul II, when they're kissing the Quran, when they're praising false religions, when they're changing Catholic dogma, like on the death penalty, on ecumenism, on everything you could think of when they have an Amazonian rite of the Mass? I mean, these are clear contradictions with the prior Catholic teaching. But using his idea of hierarchy, you can't judge the Pope. Versus in Orthodoxy, we know that the hierarchs make sense. There's been lots of heretical bishops, patriarchs, but the Catholic system, how do you have a heretical Pope? Because you can't even judge them. They can destroy your system. What do you do when the Pope goes astray? I mean, some Catholics accuse Pope Francis of heresy for Amoris Laetitia. Who are they to judge? And ultimately, this is a system where you're just submitting to the Pope whatever they want, and they can change whatever they want. Is that papal-based ecclesiology is so authoritarian. Versus in Orthodoxy, we know what Orthodoxy is. We know what the saints teach. We know what the ecumenical councils teach. This is a continuity. And so if a hierarch says something wrong, we know what is Orthodox. It's not a mystery. Look at what the saints teach. Look at what the councils teach. Like, you won't see Orthodox saints praising or saying good things about ecumenism. They will condemn it. I would say the Catholic is in a much worse position because when the Pope contradicts tradition, your entire system collapses. It's happened lots of time because it's inevitable, because we live in a fallen world. And the Pope doesn't have some special charism where he's never going to mess up. I mean, just look at the past popes. I mean, the things that they say, like Saint John Paul II saying Saint John the Baptist protect Islam and engaging in all these interfaith stuff. He's a Catholic saint. It's like, so is that Catholicism now? This is a clear contradiction. The last thing he brings up is the Filioque. And again, the Catholic Church has admitted the Orthodox position. Read the Vatican clarification on the Filioque. They admitted that it is the monarchy of the Father. And for those who aren't familiar with the Filioque, Rome added to the creed. And they added without council. And we see that the people in the East who refused the Filioque are vindicated. St. Photius, who said, hey, the Latins are wrong, they're wrong on the Filioque, he was condemned by the Pope at the time, but then the next Pope came and he reinstated Photius, and he had a council that said Photius is right, that we don't accept the Filioque in the 800s. So clearly the Filioque wasn't universally taught. Clearly the Pope can be wrong since St. Photius was right, vindicated by the next Pope in the Photian schism. This proves orthodoxy. And he says Orthodox we have an unwillingness and we're needlessly contrarian. Well, no, it's just we believe in truth. We're not going to water it down just to have a false unity. Especially the way he paints it. He says, oh, the only reason Orthodox don't want this is because if they have a reunion, the patriarchs are going to get demoted. And it's like, why would we want to submit to the Catholic Church when they don't care about their own liturgy? They literally wrecked it and made a neo-Protestant liturgy, the Novus Ordo. Why would we respect and want to be a part of that communion when we look at modern saints who don't even know the gospel? They say, help a Hindu, a better Hindu, a Catholic, a better Catholic, a Muslim, a better Muslim. That's not Christianity. You read the modern Orthodox saints, read someone like Father Seraphimos, St. Paisios. They say that is the religion of the Antichrist. It's not just, we're Orthodox are just super prideful. It's that we aren't relativists. And that's what we see in Catholicism is he brought up, Eastern Catholicism and these different branches. Well, they teach different things. Like you go to an Eastern Catholic Church, they don't recite the Filioque. They have married priests. They will sometimes reject a lot of Western dogmas. They will venerate post-schism saints like St. Gregory Palamas. So you can go to an FSSP trad parish, and I went to confession there, and they said receiving communion on the hand is a mortal sin. Okay, so all of the Novus Ordo is in mortal sin, and then this is supposed to be some unified church, and then Vatican II, the clear contradictions in that in literally every way. Read the errors of the modernists, the syllabus of errors, and compare it with Vatican II. They are a day and night difference. It is not just Orthodox pride; it's that Orthodox is the faith delivered once and all to the apostles, as it says in Scripture. And we're not going to deviate that way. We're not going to deviate from that, especially for just political reasons. It would be a lot easier if the Orthodox just were in communion and we had all these, political ties. But ultimately, truth matters, and Christ's body is one, and we can't have a false unity. The council that clarifies the doctrine of the Trinity, the Cappadocian model, teaches the monarchy of the Father. This is what all the Eastern Fathers taught and the Western Fathers. His objection is Augustine says this. Well, Craig Trula has a great video on the Western Fathers. They don't teach the Filioque. But let's just say, even if Augustine did teach the Filioque, why are you basing your faith on one church father? We don't. That's not the Orthodox way. Is we look at the consensus. We look at what is defined in the ecumenical councils. And when we go to the ecumenical councils, it teaches the monarchy of the Father. When we read the church fathers, the Cappadocian fathers who formulated this doctrine, their model of the Trinity excludes the possibility of the Filioque. Because how do we distinguish persons in the Godhead? It's by their hypostatic property. We distinguish the Father because he is the sole cause. The Son through begetting, and the Holy Spirit through procession. If you give a hypostatic property that one has that the others don't, then it's an imbalance in the Trinity. That's how we distinguish the persons in the Trinity. It's through the hypostatic properties. This is just Orthodox theology. And if you're not sure about this, there's some amazing videos by Jay Dyer, Dr. Bo Branson, explaining the monarchia of the Trinity. But again, this isn't a church dividing issue according to the Vatican. They have basically admitted they were wrong. So the major reasons that they caused the Great Schism, papal supremacy, the Filioque, they're wrong on. So I hope this video was helpful. I hope Brian researches these issues more, because I've provided lots of resources. There's so many great Orthodox channels that have answered these very common objections. And the best thing you can do is go visit a local Orthodox church. Thank you so much for watching. God bless.